Today we're talking about early recording history. And you can see the subtitle here is From Ephemeral Consumption to the Recording as Archive and the Stockpiling of Potential Experience. That's a fancy subtitle, but it actually means something pretty straightforward. Let's take it apart really quickly. Ephemeral consumption. Ephemeral means something that doesn't last very long, right? And for instance, when you buy a sandwich, right? That's ephemeral. You're going to eat it, and then it's gone. If you leave it around too long, it spoils. You can't eat it. So you either buy it, and then if you go to Subway, right? If you ever bought a Subway sandwich and then tried to leave it for a few days, I don't recommend it. So when you buy a Subway sandwich, the idea is you better eat it then. Eat it fresh, right? That's what the advertisement says. So in the early days of recording, that's really what was at stake here. The idea wasn't that you were going to save these records forever, is that there was a kind of ephemeral consumption here. In fact, while in some ways Edison expected people to be able to save certain of these recordings for a long period of time, he was also very interested in this idea of temporary archiving, that what these recordings would be used for would be to play around with. That a part of the idea is that you can record your own things and then hear them back. And we'll talk about that more in a second. From there, we move to the notion of the recording as archive, of maintaining things perhaps forever. That once you've recorded something, you can hear it again and again, and it's there as a kind of a true archive, a true record. And remember, that's part of what we mean when we talk about records. It's not just that they are the result of a recording process, but rather that they are a record of things that have gone on in the past. And then what this allows for is a kind of stockpiling. Many of us now use streaming services. Well, streaming services are also a kind of stockpiling. In fact, they're the perfect example of what I'm talking about with a stockpiling of potential experience. Think of all the things that you have available to you, say on Spotify. Most of those things you'll never listen to in your entire life. And yet part of being a consumer is this idea that you could listen to it, that it is there, it is available to you. That's part of what you pay for when you pay for your subscription to Spotify, those of you who do subscribe, or part of what you're paying for when you listen to the ads if you don't pay for Spotify. You're still paying, right? You still have to deal with the ads. That's a form of paying. So what you're paying for here is not just what you actually listen to, although that might be what it feels like directly, but what you could potentially listen to, what is available to you, even if you never get around to it. We'll be talking about these themes as we move along. So the first stop on our little journey here is the piano player. In 1863, that was the development of the first practical player piano. By Forno Pianista, and it was displayed in Philadelphia in 1876, so many years later, as you can see, over a decade later, along with a model by John McTamaney and one other model. And these three models led to the classic model known as the pianola or the Aeolian Company. So they sort of shared elements of their patents, and this led to the pianola, which was released by and marketed by the Aeolian Company. They pursued one of the most high-profile advertising campaigns of the era, and by 1903 had more than 9,000 roll titles. In other words, a roll title here is just these various pianists would make piano rolls. They would play on the piano. The piano would inscribe what they were playing, right? It was usually not perfect. Someone would have to then go back and edit the rolls, and what that meant was they would have to punch in notes that didn't quite get hit properly, either because the pianist didn't press down hard enough or because there was a mechanical malfunction, or they were simply adding things that the pianist didn't even do. Right? So there are all sorts of ways in which those piano rolls aren't exactly transcriptions of what someone actually played. They're kind of an idealized transcription. And the advertising campaign, we'll talk about it more as we go along here, but this was one of the most concentrated efforts to get people to buy something that they believed people just didn't quite need or didn't know they needed. And this becomes very typical of consumerism in general. Remember, we said this before, that the notion of consumer capitalism is that you have to produce not just commodities, but needs or felt needs. You have to produce desires. Nobody needs a player piano. In fact, in some ways, some player pianos are kind of a pain in the butt, because if you actually try to play on them, some of them you can very easily play on. Others, it creates various problems if you try to play on them as a piano. So here you have an instrument that you can't exactly use, and you have to buy material for so it can be played, or you can't use it directly. And it's a large mechanism. It's not easy to get people to feel that they really need it, and it's expensive, much more expensive than the phonograph will soon be. Sales peaked in 1924, so after the phonograph is already around, but then they decline, in part owing to the availability and accessibility of the phonograph, and more specifically the radio, which becomes a major force, as we'll see in the 1920s. Here is the 4-note model, and you can see the roll goes in that little empty space there. You see the two panels push by, and you put the roll in there, and then you have pedals at the bottom. Those pedals are not for you. They're not the normal pedals. They're not for you they're not a damper pedal, and they're not a sustain pedal. Rather, what they are is a pedal for operating the machine. The early player piano didn't just run on its own, and even early models, you could set them to either run on their own or to run with you pumping the pedal to keep the tempo. So you pumping the pedal helped the roll move, and if you pumped it evenly, then you got a nice even performance, and if you pumped it unevenly, then you got a pretty uneven performance. This is actually, we might think of that as a pain in the butt. We might think, well, that means that it wasn't designed very well. I mean, why do I want to sit there and pump my foot the whole time that this thing is playing? But we're going to see that part of the advertising campaign was an attempt to make that what seems like a debit into a credit. What seems like a something that detracts from our desire to buy this thing, and it's something that really leads us to desire. And how that works is one of the clever elements of their advertising campaign. So let's move to that in just a second. What we're talking about here is a threat of passivity. And we already saw this last session with Sousa, right? Sousa said that the problem with mechanical music, and the player piano is a form of mechanical music, is that people don't have to develop any skill, they don't have to develop any intelligence, and they don't have to develop any feeling with respect to music. Those were his three concerns: skill, intelligence, feeling. And so the fear here is that what we're doing is we're moving ourselves into a passive role where we're not even actively listening, much less thinking about, much less performing the music. Now, these days, we think of the player piano as a kind of oddity. But around 1900, it was thought of as having transformative potential. And the phonograph was the idol of amusement. The phonograph was the thing that people thought of as a gimmick. Right? So from 1919 to 1925, more player pianos were produced each year in the U.S. than actual pianos that you played. Right? More player pianos were available than so-called manual pianos produced and available. Early player pianos had to be played. They weren't entirely passive by operating that foot pedal, and the foot pedal controlled the speed of the performance. This was a major part of the marketing campaign in selling these devices. It reduced the notion of passivity that many people found troubling. So it was, in essence, an answer to the kind of qualms that Sousa had about mechanical music, right? That you weren't just passively listening to the player piano. And in fact, there are a series of journals released that show you how to be better at quote-unquote playing the player piano. Let's take a look at one. Here you see this cherubic figure, right? It's not a baby, it's a cherub. You see the wings on its back. A cherub, of course, is a representation of Cupid is a cherub figure, and Cupid, of course, is about romantic love and entanglement in that sense of feelings of the heart. But also a cherub, as in the cherubs in heaven, are innocent figures, right? So I think it's interesting that they use a cherub here as the demonstration. This is an ad from 1917, so right at the peak of production of player pianos. And notice what it says, the manualo. Notice what that is, of course. A manual piano is not a player piano. A manual piano is one that you actually play. This piano you could play, but you could also play the roll. And when you do play the role, even then you have to manipulate those pedals. And so here you see this innocent, right? Why an innocent? Why a cherub? Well, part of this, I think, this is just my reading of it, but I think that the name Manualo here is meant to make you feel like you are actually playing a real piano, that you are really involved here, and you were born to play it. Now, born to play it can mean two different things. On the one hand, it can mean that you were predestined to play it. Oh, this is the thing. This is meant for you, right? But also, born to play it means that you can play it in a sort of innocent state. You don't have to be necessarily skilled at music or know much about music in order to play this, right? So you can really learn relatively quickly how to quote unquote play this thing, or really just operate the mechanism is all that it amounts to, and feel like you've accomplished something without necessarily accomplishing much of anything at all, right? Notice that it says at one point, as if playing by hand, that you get the pleasurable sensation as if playing by hand. And this is a very tricky part of, I think, mechanical reproduction of music, that there's an element here of the as if. We're going to see this with the phonograph as well. We listen to it as if we're in the same room with the performers. We play the piano as if we're playing a normal, regular, manual piano, and that's built into the name here, Manualo. This as-if structure is a major part of what it means to deal with mechanical music, and I think it should be one of the main themes that we discuss in relation to it, this notion of the as-if. I'm involved in this kind of virtual relationship with music when I'm involved with mechanical music. Of course, when we think of mechanical music, this is what normally comes to mind. Recordings in the sense of Edison and the phonograph. Edison developed the phonograph in 1888, and he was pretty dissatisfied with it. He lost interest in it almost right away. It was when other people began to be interested in that invention and began doing their own things with it that he returned to the phonograph game, and let's turn to that. But here you see a picture of him. I don't remember. The phonograph was developed actually a little earlier than 1888. It was developed, I believe, in the 1870s. We'll see in the next slide. So this is when he's returning to it, and you can see that this is a little more developed than the earlier phonograph, and there he is sort of slumped in listening. Notice that he's got earbuds in, right? You had to listen with these earpieces. It didn't produce a strong enough sound to listen to it through a speaker at this time, and they didn't really have electrical speakers. So eventually there would be a little horn and an amplifier of a much more sort of acoustic, in a much more acoustic fashion. But here the mechanism is relatively weak, so you had to listen with earphones, and we're going to talk more about that. But I think it's nice that it's illustrated here in this photograph. So Thomas Edison, 11 years earlier than that photograph we just saw, he demonstrated the phonograph in 1877, but then immediately lost interest in it and went on to other of his inventions. It consisted of a sensitive diaphragm modeled on the tympanum of the human ear, so the eardrum, basically. So there's a sensitive diaphragm which registers vibrations in the air caused by sound waves. That he attached the diaphragm to a stylus, to a needle, whose undulations trace the movements of the vibrating membrane onto a delicate, impressionable surface of tinfoil or wax covering a cylinder. Now, tinfoil and wax, they will both inscribe sound, but they will do it in a very weak manner, and a manner that can easily be erased. And then, all you have to do is grab the tinfoil and stretch it out. You've lost everything. Or you wipe the wax and you literally wipe away the sound, right? So we're talking about a rather fragile inscription of sound here. The other thing is that this device could both record and playback sounds. So if you had this wax cylinder version of the device, for instance, you could record yourself speaking into it, just like I'm recording myself digitally speaking to you now. You could record it and then play it back for yourself. So it wasn't just a matter of buying records and playing them, or buying cylinders, rather, and playing them, but rather you could record your own things and play it. And this is a big part of what he thought the phonograph should do, and we'll turn to that in a minute. But before we do that, let's take a look at one of these early models. Here you see a very early model, and you can see the crank there, and I don't see the place where you would put in the earbuds, but there would have to be some. Or maybe, I guess, yeah, this model, I think, is the attempt here is to get the sound to come through that tube as a kind of primitive amplifier, but these models are museum pieces. They don't work very well. This is clearly the tinfoil type rather than the wax cylinder type. You can see the etchings on the edge of the cylinder there, and obviously this is a pretty primitive model. Here's one that's much more further along. Now you have the horn there, which projects a lot better than earlier models. You can also see there's a protective cover for the wax cylinder, so that you would have to lift that cover and then put the wax cylinder in. You can also see two holders for two different wax cylinders there. So what you would do, or maybe it's a single wax cylinder with two parts that close, but what you do is you put the very sensitive, very delicate wax cylinder into these little containers. Then you take them out and you put them into the cover on the phonograph itself, and then the stylus runs along it. Now the problem, of course, as you can imagine with either tinfoil or with the wax cylinder, is unlike a CD, for instance, every time you play this record, it gets a little worse. Now this is somewhat true of records now. If you take good care of them, they'll last you a long time. But with the cylinder, even if you took very good care of it, I mean, first of all, you can't dust it, you can't touch it in any way, or else you've deformed it. So you have to be particularly careful with it in general. But also, every single time you play it, you are creating further indentations, and therefore you are creating less fidelity in the sound. So this is a very delicate and, as I said, ephemeral product. Even though Edison did have in mind the possibility of archiving certain things, he recognized that those things could not be listened to very often if they were going to be archived. So let's take a look at some of the things that he thought one ought to do with the phonograph. The cylinders, as I said, they wore out very easily. They had to be treated very carefully. They were also pretty quiet, and you generally had to listen with ear tubes. Those little funnels that we saw were also used, but usually not very effectively. So a lot of the listening that took place in the public had to be done with ear tubes, because anyone talking in even a moderately loud voice would have obscured the tinny small sounds coming out of these recordings. You could not make copies from a master, so each copy had to be made anew. So if I recorded something that I liked, let's say I recorded a song and I liked that performance, I couldn't make other copies from that performance. Even if I tried to play it and then play it into another device, that wouldn't work, because it simply doesn't produce a loud enough sound for that to work. So you couldn't make copies from a master. Every recording was a new recording. Now that works out in a very interesting way for certain performers at this time, and we'll take a look at that in a moment. Now, Edison thought of the machine as being primarily used to take minutes during meetings to be transcribed later. In other words, it was truly an ephemeral recording that he was thinking of. So let's say we were having a meeting and we wanted to not have to have somebody be a secretary at that meeting so that they could participate in it without being distracted by writing down notes. We could record the whole thing, put the recording device in the middle, record the whole thing, and then the secretary could afterward transcribe everything. The idea isn't that you would listen to the whole meeting again. You would still transcribe it into notes, but that way it was facilitating this and allowing people to participate in the meetings. The music was very low on his list of reasonable uses for the machine. He actually thought of it as the other thing that he thought would be very useful is that you could record the last words of your dying loved ones, right? But he recognized that if you did that, then you'd have to put that recording away and only listen to it very, very rarely, because every single time you listen to it, you make the recording worse. So it's not something you can listen to over and over again and maintain that level of fidelity, and it's already a low level of fidelity. Now, he becomes inspired by Berliner's improvements to the machine, and we're going to talk about those in a moment. And then he begins marketing his own machine around 1890, and he creates nickel-operated phonographs that can be placed in public venues, mostly drugstores, and then phonograph parlors, right? So he creates a business model, really, for listening to these things. Notice it's a sort of gimmicky business model, and that's how it was in the late 19th century and early 20th century. Phonographs were kind of a gimmick. They were kind of something fun. So if you went to like their equivalent of CVS, you could go over to the side and listen to a phonograph while you're waiting for your prescription to be filled or waiting for whatever else. And you would put in a nickel and then listen to the piece. Now this creates an entire industry that we'll talk about in a moment. You can see here the original Edison cylinder where people are recording into it. There's a little barbershop quartet here singing Sweet Adeline into it, and then they'll listen to it back and sort of laugh, and maybe they'll try again, wipe it clean and do it again, or maybe they'll save it to show their loved ones or their friends or whatever. But the point here isn't that they're making some kind of professional recording. These are amateurs making amateur recordings for their own amusement. Now, Berliner comes along and really improves what the recordings can do. Now, we're going to start using a distinction that's an important one, right? When I say phonograph for these early discussions of early recording, I mean Edison's phonograph. That's what he called it. And notice that it works with the wax cylinder or the tin foil. It's not the kind of thing that you would have ever seen outside of a museum, probably, unless you have unless you are or have a relative or a friend or an acquaintance who collects these things, and they're pretty rare, but you can find them still. That's the original phonograph. What Berliner's going to develop is called the gramophone, and that is what becomes what we now call the phonograph, right? So it's the gramophone model that wins out. Let's take a look at what that is. In 1888, the Prussian immigrant, so from what is now Germany, Emil Berliner, he demonstrated his gramophone at the Franklin Institute at Philadelphia. He had no scientific education, but he'd already gained some notoriety for improvements on Bell's telephone. So this is a amateur inventor, amateur scientist, no real education, but he's a tinkerer. He knows how to figure out things with mechanical devices, and he's quite gifted at it. And he created some improvements in the fidelity of sound in Bell's telephone, and he became interested in the phonograph, but he thought that Edison's model was totally misguided. So he comes up with his own and calls it the gramophone. And what it does is it incises sound onto a flat metal disc coated with a waxy petroleum-based solution. Then what you do is you dip that in and process it like an etching. You dip it into acid to make a negative from which numerous copies could be made with higher fidelity than is possible on the phonograph. In other words, here you have, in some ways, the exact opposite of the phonograph. The phonograph, you can record directly onto it, and there's no special process. As soon as you're done recording it, you can listen back to it, just like tape or just like I'm doing now with this digital recording. I can record it, I can stop it, I can listen back immediately. Can't do that with the gramophone. With the gramophone, there's a process involved that makes it into a negative, and then that makes copies off of that master that created through that other process. So the advantage here is you have much better sound. And in fact, Berliner soon develops other ways, as we'll see, and people following Berliner develop other ways to make it better and better sound. And you're etching it more strongly into this petroleum-based solution, this waxy solution. And once you've done that, you save that master, you make some copies of the negative, and you save those. And then you can make as many copies as you want that will all have slightly less faithful sound than the master, but they'll all be pretty good. And if you make them all from the master instead of making copies of copies, which of course you can't do without making another master anyway, then you have relatively decent sound, all just slightly degraded from the original. And you can save the original masters, and you make several, so that you can continually produce these recordings. So notice that you can't make your own recordings unless you have access to all this processing material, which most people wouldn't, but you do get better recordings from professional developments of these recordings, professional studios. The gramophone recorded sound onto the sides of the groove. This is one of his major innovations, not the bottom of the trench. And what this allows for is both greater volume and reduced distortion, because it's protected. So the needle doesn't go straight. The needle has a little curve in it. And that's still true of the phonograph today. Take a look at your phonograph if you have one, or if someone you know has one, and you'll see that the needle actually comes out at an angle. It doesn't go straight down. And this is because it allows for reduced distortion and greater volume. You listen through an inverted funnel acting as a kind of amplifier instead of the earbuds, although you could listen through earbuds, but it's a lot louder now, so you don't need that. In 1897, Berliner switched from vulcanized rubber, which tended to lose its grooves, to a shellac filler mix, and this was used right through the Second World War as being the primary material. And it was good at reproducing sound, this material. Here's a pretty ugly early version of the gramophone. This is a really early model, and you can see it's very metallic, very heavy looking, and it goes right to the metal disc there that would support the gramophone. Now, what we've in essence created is two different models for our relationship to sound. The phonograph model is one in which it is really a matter of a kind of ephemeral oddity. We can use it in all sorts of different ways. We can use it for minutes and so on, like we were saying. We can record directly onto it and then listen right back. But every time we listen, it gets a little worse. We cannot make copies from a master, so every copy has to be individual. Every recording is of something that has taken place in real time, one time only, right? Now, granted, I guess you could, and people did, put 2 or 3 machines in front of them and make 2 or 3 recordings from a single act or a single event, but that's as much as you could do. You can only get 3 machines around you where you're singing more or less directly into it, and then the one in the middle is always going to be the best, right? So even then, you don't have 3 equally good recordings. The gramophone, however, you can make a recording of a single event and make as many copies as you want. And so that creates a very different economic model. Let's take a look at a musician of this time who profited from the early recording industry and how it affected him. And that musician is George Washington Johnson. George Washington Johnson's a very interesting figure in a lot of ways. He gets his start supposedly being a busker. He was working on the Staten Island Ferry, or maybe it wasn't the Staten Island Ferry, but I think it was actually a ferry that ran between New York and New Jersey. I'd have to look it up. At any rate, it was a ferry. And what he would do is he would sing these songs to passengers, asking for money, just like you see people doing it on the subway and in the subway stations today, or in Central Park or whatever. And one day somebody hears him, Lou Spencer supposedly hears him doing this and suggests that he makes a recording. Now, the recordings that he makes at first are on the Edison model, right? The songs, by the way, there are 2 basic songs. One is a whistling song, and the other is a laughing song. Now, that doesn't sound like a lot of material, and it's not. But they're both very striking. And they both record very well. Whistling, because of its pure tone, and because you're not trying to get language out. Language doesn't record super well, at least sung language, in the early Edison models. Spoken language does okay. But sung language, because of the mixture of consonants and vowels and so on, because of the various things that your mouth does in motion, it doesn't record quite as well as simple tones of whistling or as raucous rhythmic tones of laughing, right? So those 2 things record quite well, and those are the 2 basic songs that George Washington Johnson performed. He performed other songs, don't get me wrong, but those were the 2 main ones, a laughing song and a whistling song. So he's one of the earliest recording stars. Sometime around early 1890, he was recorded by two different phonograph distributors. A lot of people think it was Len Spencer. I think I said Lou before, but Len Spencer who discovered him, but it may not have been. He was recording for two different phonograph distributors, Charles Marshall of the New York Phonograph Company and Victor Emerson of the New Jersey Phonograph Company. Notice that they're both phonograph companies, meaning that what he's doing is he's working on the Edison model. He had two major hits, as I mentioned, and there were no masters. So every copy had to be recorded separately, or, for a while, Spencer had him doing three at a time. And that was the one song was called the Whistling Song, sometimes the Whistling Coon, and the other was called the Laughing Song, sometimes the Laughing Coon. And like I said, there have to be as many performances or as many copies of these things as there are performances. So there are some that have survived to today that you can hear, but there would have been many, many different versions of this. Basically, what he was doing during this time is he's showing up at the recording studio in the morning, and they're paying him per performance, just like he would be paid, busking. They're paying him per performance, and he's just singing these two songs, and for a while he's doing them every day, all day, 5 days a week, for several months, maybe even years, depending on who you believe. Over the course of several years, right? This is his full-time job. He's getting paid for singing these same two songs. Why? Because, as we said, those recordings wore out very easily. Let's imagine for a moment what it would have been like in a pharmacy in New York City, right? You have, let's say, 5 at a fairly large pharmacy, 5 to 8 machines that are coin operated and that you can listen to. Maybe 4 of the machines have one recording, 4 of them have another. You can't touch it because you'll ruin it. So you can only listen to the same things over and over again. You have these two things to choose from. You listen to them. Every time you listen to them, they get a little worse. People are very interested in this as an oddity. They're listening over and over again. People are standing in line, put their money down, they listen. The recordings get worn out. Some stories say that the recordings of these two songs, which were among the most popular, got worn out at the rate of roughly 5 times per day. So you needed 5 copies per machine per day. And there were couriers that were hired by the phonograph companies that their entire job was just to deliver more copies of these same songs. So he's recording them over and over again every day, and that's how he's making his living. But then in 1894, he makes a mistake, I think. He began recording with Len Spencer, who, like I said, earlier was working for these phonograph companies, but now he's working on the Berliner model, and he makes a master that can be mass-produced. And here it is. In a sense, this is a career ender for Johnson. This is a gramophone recording of the Whistling Coon, and now you can make as many copies as you want from a master, and you don't have to pay Johnson because they didn't develop mechanical rights yet. They didn't think of that yet. They didn't think of this as part of copyright. Copyright, as you remember, applies only to written sheet music. So it really protects the sheet music publisher. Now, we'll see that the recording industry soon finds ways to create protections for itself, and it finds ways to get a mechanical right, and we'll talk about when that comes about. It comes about really in the 20s, and we'll talk about that soon. But at this stage of the career, this is the Wild West. People don't know anything about this. This is brand new, right? So they're sort of making it up as they go. So when Len Spencer offers to record Johnson this way, he signs a contract with Johnson to do the same thing that he was doing before. He doesn't get paid much more than he already was getting paid. A little more, but not much. Johnson doesn't expect royalties from this stuff, right? So this is the end. They don't need him to record it again. They've got it. And for a while, he's still recording for these various phonograph companies because they haven't adopted this new technology yet. They're trying to compete with it. They're trying to show their model as being the more viable model. Of course, it's not. The historical winner is the gramophone, not the phonograph. The name phonograph wins out, but not the model. And so Johnson really kind of loses his career with this. Now, Johnson retires a very wealthy man. How do I know this? Because Johnson winds up in a court case where he's accused of having murdered his girlfriend, which he didn't do, and he is exonerated. And a lot of very famous people come to this trial because they knew his recordings and they knew him. So he was a wealthy man. He made a career really out of these two songs, especially for a black man at this time, and especially for a black entertainer at this time. He did quite well for himself, but this was the end of that. Once he made these gramophones, that was the sign of the end. Now, a major figure for us is this man, Eldridge Johnson. He developed a spring motor to replace the earlier options the gramophone offered. So the earlier options really involved a very noisy motor and an unreliable hand crank where you had to actually keep time by cranking it evenly. His motor, Eldridge Johnson's motor, was cheaper and much more reliable. He then developed a method for making master copies of records using a zinc disc covered in acid-resistant fatty coating, etching the sound into the coating and putting it into an acid bath to deepen the grooves. And this was, again, an improvement over anything Berliner had done. In 1900, he buys the Berliner's company, or at least the U.S. assets of that company. And then in October of 3rd, 1901, he creates the Victor Talking Machine Company, established in Camden, New Jersey, the same area where Edison was working. And he absorbed Berliner. Berliner wound up doing something kind of stupid. Berliner had he didn't know, it wasn't his fault exactly. He had a business manager, and he signed over way too many rights to his lawyer/manager. And of course, this was a lawyer. So the lawyer created this very complicated contract that Berliner didn't realize what he was signing. And then the lawyer was able to claim rights, in fact, close to exclusive rights over all the patents. But what he wasn't able to do was to claim rights over the improvements that Johnson had made. And so Berliner's only real option was to sell out to Johnson, who did not have any relationship with that lawyer. So Johnson was able to create his own company and sort of bypass the lawyer. And Berliner, who did all the work in establishing the company, had to sell his rights fairly cheaply. And it's a shame. But what Johnson then does is he designs 5 new models, and he sold 7,570 in the year 1901. 7,570 units, right? And that's quite impressive. This is his first real year in business. Now it was a 3-way race for customers among Edison's National Phonograph Company, Edward Easton's Columbia Phonograph Company, and Victor. Columbia uses both cylinders and discs. It's trying to sort of, use both models. But these are the 3 big companies. And so this is the first time we've needed to know about recording companies, and we're going to trace the big companies throughout the history of popular music. So here's where we start. You have the Edison, which is the wax model, the wax cylinder model. You have the Edward Easton Phonograph Company, which is used in both, and then you have the Victor Company, which is, of course, using the Berliner technology and run by Johnson. And the other thing that Berliner does is he buys the mascot for Victor Records, this dog listening to his master's voice, from a British company. And he is able to use that logo. And here's a version of it from 1902. And you can see it's a very effective model. Let's turn to a clearer instantiation of it in the next slide. You can see it's his master's voice. So it's this dog listening to a recording, and then he's so impressed by the fidelity of the recording that he thinks it might be that his master's actually down there in the tube, I guess. Now, in a way, this is misleading, because why would his master have created a recording? That applies more to the Edison model, and in fact, that's what the original logo was designed to exemplify, was the Edison model, not the Berliner model. So in one sense, it doesn't apply to the Berliner, but in another sense, it very much does, because the fidelity that it's obviously meant to illustrate is much more applicable to the Berliner model than the Edison model. Fidelity is much more characteristic of the Berliner model. So to win out, to really win in this 3-way race that we were talking about, Eldridge Johnson designs the Red Seal recordings to market what he calls class to the masses. He's trying to sell machines, of course, but in selling machines, he's pushing recordings. And this is a brilliant scheme. right? Edison, for the most part, when he's selling the machine, he's selling the technology, he's selling the machine to you. The idea is that, yeah, you're going to listen to some professional recordings, but you're also going to make your own recordings, and that's part of the gimmick of the machine. For Johnson, of course, for the Victor Recording Company, that can't be the case. You can't make your own recordings with the Victor technology. You're only going to buy professional recordings. So why would you buy the machine unless you had recordings to listen to on it? So he's going to push these recordings as the major selling point here. So he signs a commercial agreement with the Gramophone Company Limited in England, and what that allowed him to do is Gramophone could buy up to half of Johnson's recordings, creating a revenue stream. So they're selling his recordings in England, and they get a big cut, and he gets a big cut. This agreement also helps to pay for research and development, a development laboratory, and then of course Victor can use that trademark that was part of the company in England, His Master's Voice dog that we just looked at. In 1902, what Victor does is he signs Enrico Caruso, right? And what that does is it creates a revenue stream using a very popular performer at the time. Opera is somewhere in between classical and popular music at this time, and especially when it comes to Caruso. People were very interested in his voice and him as a kind of star. So this is the beginning of the Red Seal recordings. With Victor recordings starting at least in 1902, you have two different seals. You have the Black Seal recordings, which is where they started, and the Red Seal recordings. By 1903, you can have double-sided recordings, and the Black Seal recordings do. So you can have recordings on both sides of the discs. So basically what that means is we're not talking about long-playing records. We're talking about singles. So a black-sided recording would have literally two songs, one per side. You had that technology. But the Red Seal recordings remain one-sided all the way until 1923. Why? Because this adds the ideal of the singular, self-contained work. It gives the recordings an aura of art. So you're paying a little more than you are for the black side recordings, and you're getting less music, right? You're getting one fewer song because the black label recordings have two, and this only has one. But the idea is that when we're listening to a piece by Enrico Caruso, then we're only hearing that one song. It's the singularity of art. Here you see Caruso. He released recordings with Victor Records starting in 1902. He was paid £500 for the first session. That's a lot of money, an incredible, unbelievable amount. By 1904, Caruso actually lived in New York City. He was singing at the Metropolitan, and he had an exclusive contract with Victor Records. In 1910, he received over $70,000 in royalties. Now, this is really unique in some ways. For the most part, if you were a recording star at this time, in the early decades of the 20th century, you didn't have this kind of contract. You were paid for the performance that you were doing, and then you walked away, and that was it. And the people who were releasing the recordings, they made all the royalty income. They made the money from sales. They didn't even think of it as royalties. They were just making a cut of the sales. But what Caruso was doing is he signed a contract. He realized how much was being sold in his name. So he signed a contract where he would get a few pennies per record, just a few pennies. But they're selling so well that in 1910 alone, he received $70,000 doing this. Here we can see one of the red label records, and you can see it's literally a red label. You have the Victor logo on it. This is the Rigoletto Quartet from Act 3, and it features Caruso and obviously three other singers. That's why it's a quartet. So they're basically using these operatic songs for most of the red label recordings. The idea is that it's, and Will Rogers, for instance, the great raconteur, the great storyteller of Ziegfeld's Follies and so on, tells these stories about he and his dad collecting these recordings, and then his dad, who didn't have a lot of money, they were lower middle class at best, they were really working class people, and his dad would save up money to buy these recordings, and then he would put them on a special shelf, and they could only be played at certain times of the week and so on, and they were venerated. And so that shows that this is a guy that didn't have a lot of money, right? I mean, he could have bought 2 or 3 of the black label recordings of popular music for the price that he's paying for one Enrico Caruso recording, but because it was the Enrico Caruso recording, it had this sense of art to it. Now, of course, the other thing about the Caruso recordings, and you can really hear it in the one there that I have pictured, because his voice comes across so much cleaner than the others. He's got this voice that's really quite remarkable for recording. It pierces through. And so even when you'll hear with these recordings, I mean, he's usually recording with some kind of organ, sometimes piano, although piano still doesn't record very well, so it doesn't sound good, or some pared down orchestra. And his voice comes out much cleaner than anything else. His voice sounds like it might have been recorded much later with a much later technology, but it isn't. It's just that it is one of those voices that records very well, cuts through very well. So let's make a slight turn here, and then we're going to return to early recordings, because one of the things that happens with early recordings is that African American spirituals are recorded quite often, actually, or things derived from spirituals, in the early recording industry, and they're some of the finest recordings of that period. But they're conducted really in the manner of parlor songs. They're arranged in the manner of popular song, and of course that's not exactly how spirituals first derived. So let's back up a bit to the pre-Civil War era once again, and talk a little bit about where African American spirituals began in a kind of ecstatic syncretism. Syncretism, by the way, is a approach to religion where you're taking some traditional notions or religious beliefs from one source and combining them usually with a kind of colonial form of religion that's been imposed upon you. And that's what often happens with actually Christianity from its very foundations is an ecstatic, it is ecstatic also, but it's a syncretic form of religion. Think about, for instance, the Easter egg. Why an Easter egg? What does an egg have to do with Christ being resurrected? It's because the Easter egg comes from the Dionysian religious beliefs, and so Dionysus is also a god who comes back to life, who is resurrected, and the egg is one of the symbols associated with him, and that gets combined syncretically with Christ. So syncretism is really a part. It's almost unremarkable in some ways as a part of many religions. And obviously, when Christianity was offered to and sometimes imposed upon African Americans, upon the slaves, they combined that with some of their traditional beliefs. So the spiritual was originally a religious folk song deriving from slave adaptations of African musical traditions to Christianity. And it was first noticed in the latter half of the 18th century and performed at so-called brush arbor meetings or camp meetings featuring ring shouts, which involve singing, hand clapping, and dancing in a circle, ring, and ecstatic trances. And this relates to some traditions that continue to today. Many spirituals weren't stabilized in this period. There's no written document, no set form. Rather, the leader would improvise or borrow a traditional melody line, and the rest of the people would sing and offer a heterophonic response. We've already seen this. It's called lining out, and we saw that white colonists, did the same kind of thing. We were talking about this in the session on folk music practices. So the rhythms, meters, and harmonies deriving from the heterophony were strange to those more accustomed to Western music. Here you can see a ring shout. You can see the fellow up on the raised platform there. He would be the leader. He's going to sing or improvise lines that they're going to repeat, and then they're singing and dancing in a circle, and you can see them there. You can also see the 4 women with their hands raised in the air in a kind of ecstatic gesture. Right? The idea of these being strange performances, I think, has to do in part, I think it's self-evident that has to do in part with the fact that they're associated with blackness, right? The lining out was also thought of as a strange practice, but not nearly as often as it noted for its strange characters as these African American practices. The ecstasy there that the women are experiencing, ecstasy literally means standing outside of oneself, right? So it sometimes involves the notion of spirit possession, or being aware of the spirit, of leaving your sort of everyday desires and assumptions and connecting in some way with the divine. Ecstasy and ring shouts and similar practices are still very common in certain types of religion, for instance, Santeria or Candomblé in Brazil, which are ecstatic religions. They're religions that involve spirit possession, where by dancing and singing and you're opening yourself up to a kind of trance state, and then the spirit will come and inhabit you, and you will have these ecstatic experiences, whether they be visions or the ability to foretell the future or to see things more clearly or what have you. Frederick Douglass, in his book My Bondage, My Freedom of 1855, writes that a keen observer might have detached in our repeated singing of O Canaan, sweet Canaan, that I am bound for the land of Canaan, something more than a hope of reaching heaven. We meant to reach the north, and the north was our Canaan. This is a very popular still view of spirituals, and it's open to some debate, I suppose, but you can see here Frederick Douglass endorsing it and really being one of the first popularizers of this notion, that the spirituals were used for code, that they were used for emancipation and liberation in the more direct sense, not just in the sense of, the meek shall inherit the earth, that you will get your heavenly reward, but rather that people wanted to escape enslavement here on this earth, and that the spirituals were sometimes marshaled as ways of depicting that. Some of these stories get told in rather elaborate and unfortunately unprovable ways, that certain spirituals were used supposedly by the Underground Railroad to give exact instructions, and you can see that in discussions of the life of Harriet Tubman. But the texts that come down to us, of course, are much more general in their approach and do have to do with this liberation theology that is still very important, right? That part of what theology is, part of what Christianity is a liberation from not just sin, but from our earthly limitations. The old way of performing the spiritual is rather rare on recordings. You're not going to hear a lot of ring shouts, at least not from that time. There are plenty of recordings now, though, that recreate it, and you can see YouTube videos that attempt to recreate these traditions. But there are some recordings from the 1920s and 30s, and again in the 70s and later, of the Gullah Geechee on the Sea Islands off Georgia and South Carolina that many scholars feel is closer to the original practice. The Gullah Geechee, this is interesting. The Sea Islands off of Georgia and South Carolina were underdeveloped in many ways. They are among the earliest places that have a full social system of freed blacks. Part of the reason was that even before the Civil War, this area didn't produce as much, as many crops as would have been able to sustain a real plantation. And so a lot of the white slave owners just left, and many of them, not all of them of course, but many of them just left the slaves there, and they were in essence freed by that. This area is still the subject of some controversy because now it is being sold as resort land, and you can see various documentaries on this. Kumbaya is the Gullah dialect for come by here, meaning Christ come to us. And the earliest surviving recording is from April 17th, 1926, and I want you to listen to that through the Smithsonian site that's mentioned on your syllabus. The texts without music were published in the 1860s. The African American spiritual then becomes more or less a parlor song, and that's how it's much more often recorded in the early days of recording. In the 1870s is the creation of the Fisk Jubilee Singers at Fisk University. Fisk University in Tennessee is one of the first universities for black people, with black professors and a black, at least eventually a black administration, or soon thereafter a black administration. And it was followed by many imitators. So Howard University and various other universities are following the Fisk University model. They created, the Jubilee Singers created many arrangements in a classical, almost Schubertian style with piano accompaniment of these spirituals, of these African American spirituals, and they were prepared by figures such as Harry T. Burleigh. Harry T. Burleigh is a very important African American composer and musician. He studied with Dvorak. So when Dvorak came to the U.S. in order to help foster, he was teaching in New York City, to help foster a American approach to composition, Burleigh was one of the people that studied with him. I always think that Burleigh really got the raw end of that deal, because during his lessons, Dvorak would encourage him to sing African-American spirituals and folk songs to him, and Dvorak would transcribe them and later use them in some of his own compositions. So I always think of this as the great rip-off composition lessons of U.S. history, but there you have it. And then you also have a cappella arrangements by R. Nathaniel Dett, some of the most famous and celebrated arrangements. In fact, if you've ever sang arrangements of spirituals, I would be willing to bet that at least one of them came from one of these two men. Now, this was a vexed issue at the time. For some, the spirituals were too connected to the abomination of slavery to be worth preserving. Frederick Douglass felt this way at times and then changed his mind at other times. He felt that it was so connected to the pain of slavery that maybe we would be better off just leaving it behind. And then at other times, because of what you saw, we read a moment ago, he felt that it was so connected to slavery and so connected to a sort of liberation theology that they had to be preserved in some fashion. So for others, the spirituals, along with minstrelsy, was among the only indigenous forms of music in the U.S. and therefore had to be preserved. That it was an important part of American expression. And you could see this, for instance, in Dvorak's claims, right? And we can talk about this more in our discussion sessions if you wish. But Dvorak felt that any true American composition had to be built on indigenous material. And for him, that indigenous material was basically Native American songs and slave songs. And so in both cases, we're talking about the racialized other here as far as white society is concerned. Dvorak felt that European-derived people were too bound up in European forms of expression. Now, this is, of course, a tricky issue, right? And one that we want to consider more. There's a sense here in which the folk music has to be thought of as from a underprivileged from underprivileged groups of people, and something seems rather. I think there's no coincidence that it's Dvorak that would say this kind of thing, right? There's in the 19th century, and especially with people from Slavic countries like Dvorak, who comes from Czechoslovakia, there's this kind of glorification of the folk in their poverty, in their lack of modernity, right? Part of this is a reaction against modernity. It's another one of those examples of a glorification of the agrarian past, that once you've lost your connection to the land, you're no longer a true, pure person. So these people like the Native Americans and like slaves, they're more connected to the land, and so therefore they have a closer connection to this more primitive version of humanity. Now, there's a double-edged sword there. On the one hand, you're saying they're more human. You're saying that they're closer to the original notions of what it is to be human. On the other hand, you're saying they're less human. They're less advanced. They're less given to modernity. They're less given to the modern notion of what it is to be human. And so you have this sort of compliment wrapped in an insult, or an insult wrapped in a compliment, whichever way you want to see it. In a way, it doesn't matter. And so you can see that the Fifth Jubilee Singers, and these are people who are obviously promoting African American culture, and they still refer to them as slave melodies or quote unquote spirituals. Spirituals is a term that they're using, and many other people are using as a replacement for slave melody, as an attempt to lift these recordings out, or these tunes rather, out of their past and to make them something else, right? And you can see here a picture of the Jubilee Singers, and they toured quite widely, and they recorded some tunes. They're not the most prolific recording artists of spirituals from this time, in part because they were doing more of their work as live performers. Here you could see a picture from the 1880s of the Jubilee Singers. Notice that they're dressed rather well. They're not presenting themselves in slave outfits, which some of the people who were touring doing spirituals would. They would dress in plantation-like outfits and to evoke this feeling of the past. And that was against what the Jubilee Singers were interested in. They were interested in a much more reserved and professional look and demeanor. And we'll see when we talk more about African American music in the early recording industry that this is part of a program of uplift. Right? That what they're trying to do is change the image people have of African Americans by showing that they are professional, both professional in the sense of how they dress and how they comport themselves, and then professional in the sense of music. And so you see the prominently featured organ there, that what they're doing, this is meant to be parlor music. This is meant to be music that is akin to and just as good as and on par with Schubert and Chopin and all these other creators of parlor music. Let's take a look at my favorite of these composers and arrangers, and that's Harry T. Burleigh, to finish up here. Here's a picture of Harry T. Burleigh. We've already mentioned his studies with Dvorak. And what I'm interested in with him is not just the fact that he creates these piano and accompanimental arrangements of spirituals, but the way that he does it. So please listen to his version, sung by Edward Boatner, of Sometimes I Feel Like a Motherless Child. It includes some really quite surprising harmonies. He's really, this is an arrangement from the, I think, 1890s. It might be as early as the 1880s. The recording, of course, is from the early 1900s. The harmonies are really quite surprising, and I'll include a score on our Blackboard site. You have, for instance, he sets it in A minor, and he uses an A minor major seventh chord. This is a chord that we're much more familiar with in jazz, but this is something he's already using in the 1880s and 1890s, and it comes out of his knowledge of some of the French music production at the time, things like Debussy and Ravel. So this is the cutting edge, really, of harmony at this time. And he's applying it to a spiritual, to a traditional African-American song, sometimes one of the best, in my opinion. Sometimes I Feel Like a Motherless Child. It's got this haunting melody, and it's made that much more haunting by his setting of it with these really dissonant and surprising harmonies. Dissonances even in positions of relative stability. So, for instance, this A minor chord with a major seventh is used in a tonic position, so therefore a position of stability, and yet he's using this very marked dissonance there. So listen carefully to that song, and we'll discuss it more when we talk together.